let's talk about what's going on with the UAE, and specifically first the news that came out that first off the UAE has exited OPEC, which I never expected. But Matt, you read a little bit deeper into this than I initially did on the headline. So maybe talk through, how does this relate to kind of what you're seeing on the central banking layer from the UAE?
Yep. So UAE being a member of OPEC, right? Think about this as a like a sacrifice of sovereignty of your domestic economy, right? What you agree to in OPEC is to abide by production quotas, is how their policy has typically been set of the member states, and what it amounts to is a constraint on your own energy sector's exports of commodities into the global markets. And the supposed or purported benefit of that is you get better pricing as a block and better economics if you stand up and aggregate as kind of the union approach, and you band together for better economic terms for your exports. Now, what that represents at the end of the day as a cartel is a restraint of production in most cases. This framework works in a world where energy markets are all else equal, tend to be an oversupply, right? So finite demand, oversupply. All the countries agree to curtail supply so that they do better on price. And by cooperating, every member's kind of economic floor gets raised. We're in a different era at this point, but I think at the end of the day, what this amounts to, if you think back to the story 2 to 3 weeks ago, right, leaked in the financial media, um, pretty much not well kept secret that the UAB central bank uh, wanted U.S. dollar swap lines with the Fed or U.S. Treasury as counterparty. So that access was very clearly something that UAE wanted. We've talked about this. You can see it in my interview with Nick Bhatia on the Bitcoin Layer on Tuesday. We'll link to that video. But UAE has a dollar peg currency like most GCC nations, and this is just like part of that broader process playing out that we've talked about on prior episodes, where the dollar is still needed in international trade, right? They all these countries, they need to settle themselves, but they don't have like any stability on the financial layer, like the foundation of the financial layer to trust each other to ultimately settle with. And that's where the dollar comes in, and where everybody's kind of mutually agreed to opt in and piggyback on the U.S. economy and the U.S. dollar at the end of the day, to anchor their own financial systems, but really to like really facilitate their bilateral trade with each other. So in the past, let's say 1945 to 2020, all of this bilateral international trade could get away with denominating itself in dollars on this offshore dollar standard without ever interacting with the domestic US financial system. So what you would essentially see happen, more and more dollar credit gets built up in the offshore dollar credit bubble. But when push comes to shove, all of that debt, when it comes time to settle or service itself, when push comes to shove, whenever the global economy gets in a pinch and that credit expansion starts to peter off, it's been completely reliant on the U.S. domestic economy, the U.S. taxpayer, the U.S. Treasury, and the Federal Reserve to bail them out at every step of the way. That might mean lower rates from the 1980s, secular bull market in dollar interest rates. But post 2008, we've seen it more and more turning into QE, which is like monetization of this offshore dollar bubble. So what this represents, take this into account, this UAE story to leave OPEC. It's bending the knee to enter into that swap line with Washington D.C. and New York, and anchoring in directly to the domestic U.S. financial system, so that now there's actually a cost, or the there's a cost to the rest of world if they want to use the U.S. dollar, and piggyback on top of those dimensional domestic financial structures and public institutions, and the U.S. economy kind of more broadly. Um, but this UAE concession to exit OPEC, that frees them up from this international energy cartel. It brings a major supplier of energy resources into this new orbit, which, Cameron and I, we've focused in on Pax Silica starting with last week's episode. Um, and this old world of trade and offshore dollar dominated financial flows is clearly transitioning into its new state. Um, so that was a huge development from the UAE itself this week, plugging into the bigger picture of this major transition going on that Cameron, you and I have really isolated. If you want to take all of these trends and put them together, I think Pax Silica is the label we put on it for the blueprints of the new architecture.
Yep, and I added in here just kind of who else might want a dollar swap line? Already confirmed South Korea. Last year, actually, September 2025, there were reportedly talks between Besant and South Korea's representative on how they might actually implement something like that. As of right now, that is not, not in place, but obviously South Korea is also interested, also impacted by everything going on with Strait of Hormuz. I think last episode I mentioned, some plastic bag shortages, things like that. But also on the possible front, Singapore, in my mind, sticks out. It's already a major dollar funding hub for Asia, right next to Strait of Malacca. I think there's a lot of interplay there between the spheres of influence, what Matt's talking about, and then Qatar, Bahrain. These are all again directly impacted by everything going on right now with Iran. So I just want to add that in there as a little teaser there.